Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Low Production Value Sphere podcast, which is shot from my terraced hideout under Fordow Mountain. As you can see, it's quite sunny because somebody poked holes in the ceiling like a couple weeks ago. I don't know what that's about, but it's really nice. We have a veranda now. So I have with me today a returning guest who's one of my favorite e-friends, ex-friends, Twitter friends. Ex-friends is not the right word. Wilfred Reilly, who by day is a professor of political science at Kentucky State
Kentucky
University. Am
State.
I correct? Yeah, very good. I have good memory. And there's no particular agenda today. I just wanted to have a conversation because Wilfred's one of the most interesting guys I follow. We had a lot of fun on the previous podcast, which I'll link to, where we talk about his books, Hate Crime Hoaxes and Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, which are very good books. And so you should watch the podcast and then buy the books and then maybe even read the books. But here we're just gonna chat about whatever strikes our fancy. So how you doing, man?
Doing pretty well. We're doing some academic chores this summer, so we're hiring a new dean, some potential members of our department. But other than that, not much has been going on the past couple of days. I'm working on a new book. I'm writing, just living life.
Yeah, can you tell us about the book, or is it too early?
Sure. Yeah. The upcoming book is called Confidently Wrong, and it's actually in the tradition of my first book, Hate Crime Hoax. It's a fairly statistical academic style book, although it'll probably be out with one of the larger presses. In fact, it definitely will be. The question's what division of HarperCollins. But what I'm looking at is why so many expert predictions over the past really 30 or 40 years have been so wildly wrong. And there's an
Ooh,
element of
that's
humor
good.
to this. I mean, some of them are pretty funny. I mean, I remember in high school, I was terrified of getting AIDS and dying. And I think for all American and many European men, this is a common fear, the coming heterosexual AIDS epidemic.
Yeah,
And that didn't happen. There was actually a book called The Myth of Heterosexual AIDS by Mike Fermento that came
yeah,
out that pointed out that as a heterosexual white guy, or for that matter, Midwestern black guy in the USA, your lifetime chance of getting HIV is on the order of 1 in 600. And
yeah.
that's just one of many. The Club of Rome saying the world was going to run out of resources. As an investor, I think we're on peak oil 8 right now.
Yeah,
We're
right,
going to run.
right.
Yeah, I mean, but just on and on. The population bomb is probably the classic quantitative example where Paul Ehrlich went to India and just
Yes.
noticed there were a lot of Indians in India. And he predicted that the world was going to end, that the humans couldn't sustain ourselves on the planet at current levels of biomass versus food. And in the book, he failed to predict feminism, the Green Revolution, let's say 3 or 4 other things.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
the
yeah.
topic of the book is why this keeps happening, why we did it again with COVID. I think there actually is a model that academics and investors can look at. I mean, people are free to consider the model trash. It's pretty predictive. But it's basically the idea that when people make projections in the academic space, there are usually 3 or 4 charts in the paper. There's the worst case scenario. There's what's actually
Yeah.
going to happen, which is buried in the middle. And then there's sort of the best case glowing scenario. What US media and British media have done pretty consistently for 50 years is take the worst case scenario and present it as objectively real. And that then goes out even from the scientists and even from the reporters who have some incentive to exaggerate. But that goes out into just the general public space. So you have stupid people. I mean, one of our congresswomen, it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I believe, took the projection is that we have 12 years left where
Right.
the USA and Europe can contain the rise in temperature globally. China
Yeah.
hopefully will help within 1 degree. So the
Yeah.
planet will get 1 degree warmer if we don't meet this deadline. The way that's been presented in our media is we have 12 years left to live. So we have someone in Congress now printing out these signs that say we have 12 years left and so on. And that's the message most people are getting. If you actually read, and last thing on this, but if you actually read any of the climate predictions, like I read Bjorn Lomborg's book, obviously, and then
Yeah.
I looked at the papers he was responding to, And the actual projections in most of them are some people will die, mostly
And
in the
by
Horn
the
of
way,
Africa.
I'm assuming our audience know who Bjorn Lomborg is, but in case some people don't, he's this great Danish, I believe, statistician who sort of became like an anti-environmentalist by realizing how, completely absurd a lot of their claims are. And by the way, as somebody who like writes about policy for a living, like environmental groups, I read the stuff that's put out by all groups, and on average, environmental groups lie far more than any other category of group. It's like it's environmentalists here, pro-immigration here, and then everybody else is like not is like in a different league. Anyway, just bracketing that, just in case if you don't know who Bjorn Lomborg is, go read his stuff. He's got a lot of stuff online. He's a very cool guy. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, Lomborg's a great guy in person, but one of the by the way, first as an American, I would challenge the environmentalists lie more than anyone else. I think in my experience, feminists lie the most, and then black activists. I don't know if you guys have the same distribution of groups, but like everything that a BLM type or a radical women's advocate says is not going to be true. And I mean, I
That's
remember I
they're a good candidate. I mean, the wage gap canard is like pretty well established at this point, and I guess a lot of the rape statistics are BS, or
yeah,
they use different definitions of rape, or they use like phone surveys or whatever. And it's like, oh, they just ask women like, oh, have you been, sexually assaulted in the last year? And it's like, I was catcalled, or a guy grabbed my ass on the subway, which obviously is not good.
of course.
And people who do that should be arrested, but that's not rape. And then they come out with that and they say, oh, 80% of women have been raped or whatever. So I guess, yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth actually talking about a couple of those things, like in some detail. Like, first of all, a lot of it's just lying. Like, I recently
Yeah.
prepped a 20-year review of Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth, and it wasn't like mild misunderstandings of the data by these women. I mean, at one point in the book, they say that the leading cause of death for young women is anorexia. I mean, like half of the people that die are women, and about a fourth of them perhaps are young. So, I mean, if that were
Right.
true, there'd be
Right.
ambulances pulling up to sorority houses every day. You'd have
Right.
200,000 deaths a year from that. So it wasn't true. Um, but I think like the rape stats are an interesting example of how to lie with numbers. So the
Yeah.
usual way you get a statistic like 1 in 4 college women has been raped
Yeah.
is to ask people, have you ever had sex that you didn't particularly want or under the influence of alcohol or drugs? And that's a fringe
Right.
definition of rape, but
Right.
I mean, there's some heterodox scientists that have given the same study to men. Like, ever had sex you didn't much want after wine tasting day for your girlfriend, or while you were drinking at your club. I mean, and it was the same rate. It was about
Yeah.
30% for men, and it just you realize that's just completely meaningless. But you would then the second level is that you would then take that kind of thing where you find that 1 in 5 women has been raped, and you'd compare that to the number of convictions for rape that year. And the
Right.
British feminists do this a lot. You would then say, well, only 2% of rapes end in a
Uh
conviction. What you would actually do, I actually think it was Julie Bindel, who doesn't much like men, but it's a pretty serious person, who looked at and debunked this. I could be wrong about the scholar. But I mean, what you'd actually do is just take the number of charged sexual assaults in the UK or US again or whatever, and you'd look at the number of convictions. And when you do that, you find that the conviction rate in rape cases is like 60%. People are
yeah.
extremely unsympathetic to rapists. But you can't
Shocking.
wander around bars, looking. I mean, it's just all made up. And the environmental stuff is almost at that level. The thing Lomborg was debunking was basically all of these environmental papers say, look, the world's going to warm up a little. There are going to be deaths,
Yeah.
particularly in the Horn of Africa. And I would
Yeah.
never, as a empathic former veteran of the business world, say, oh, who cares? These are enemy states that are a long way away. We should help them somehow. But these are going to be some deaths. But the world in general, in terms of income, population, so on,
Yeah.
is going to continue to improve through this period. And
Yeah.
that's just always left off. The idea is, well, there'll be 2 million deaths in
Right.
Somalia. We must do anything we can to stop that. And that's a very novel attitude in terms of how we look at
Right.
morality.
Right. Right. And it's not, and yeah, it's not 2 million people dying in Somalia versus the status quo. It's 2 million people dying in Somalia versus like life improving a lot on every metric for everybody else.
Yeah, no,
Um,
I think that's probably
and so
true, actually. I mean,
we could bank the economic growth from like burning oil and then use some of that to pay for some way to rescue the Somalians, preferably in Somalia.
yeah,
uh,
I think
yeah,
something that, and I mean, I would honestly, in many situations, advocate for this. Like, I was clearly joking when I said, like, I'm the most empathic man in the world. But one solution to the problems of foreign enemy states would simply be not caring. I mean, and
yep,
I don't think that's what we're going to end up doing. I mean, I think that there are enough liberal voters, for good or ill, that we would probably send 5% of our GDP to help the poor bastards that are actually hurt by climate change. But when people say, well, we might have to cut our quality of life by a third, which, by the way, will have a massive, devastating impact on suicide rates and so on, like COVID lockdowns did,
right,
to
right,
help the people of Eritrea, one response to that is, well, no, we don't. I mean,
right.
those people currently are polluting at higher rates than we are. That's a country that has
True.
about the GDP
Also
per
true.
cap that we did in the 50s. You know, if they can't manage to build the seawall, well, that's their problem. And I
Yep.
think that any previous society would have simply said that and continued moving on. Now we're going to
Yeah.
help, and I think that's good. But the idea that we need to destroy our quality of life by
Right.
going back to burning wood and so on, all of this to me, what's being done is the legitimate but very resolvable problem as a justification for utterly changing our style of life toward gay race communism. And we see
Yeah.
this over and over again. Like, and I don't mean to be too glib about this, but like, aha, we found the problem of male sexual violence, and the solution is gay race communism. You know, we
Yeah.
found the problem of overpriced education, and the solution is, and it's just sort of like, maybe
Yeah.
you're just a communist at a certain point when you look at this.
Shocking.
Yeah, I don't I think there are many ways in nuclear power to resolve these environmental issues.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I like this is the very French thing. Like we have the like lowest per capita carbon emissions of any developed country on the planet, and it's not even close. And we just power everything with nukes. And and France, we have we call them watermelons because a watermelon is green on the outside and red on the inside. Um, and yeah, I mean the goal is to turn France, America, Germany, especially Germany, Britain into like East Germany circa 1984. And especially the Europeans, they I mean they go pretty crazy. Like they talk, we're only going to be able to use electricity like 8 hours a day. And it's like, no.
I
And
I don't think these people understand the potential of alternative realities. So, I mean, to some extent, as a formerly fairly competent fighting man, as someone with money in the bank, I mean, if someone tells me, if you stay in this state, we're going to restrict your ability to drive to 2 days a week. I mean, it's a 5 mile jog to the campus. I would probably just say, well, then I'm going to move. Or,
yeah,
you know, I'm going to join the party that's resisting this economically and probably militarily after a couple of years. So
yeah,
this is the great mistake of socialism in general. I mean, people will say things that are even accurate, like we could get every Russian to an improved level of income if we took all the land from the quote unquote kulaks, the wealthy peasants and
yeah,
craftsmen, and distributed it evenly throughout the country. But the problem with that is there's a guy sitting on the porch of his farmhouse with a gun saying, well, that's not going to happen. You see,
right,
you're going to have to work out another technique. And that's what's going to happen if you start in the USA, for example, confiscating private weapons, telling people they can't drive their big, ridiculous cars, but doing a lot of other things. I mean, a lot of our country is in the semi-arid West. So
yeah,
there's a whole, as you probably are aware, there's a whole tradition of riparian law about who gets to use water. Any
right,
attempt to centralize that and prevent good-sized towns or native tribes from watering their own pasture would be met with a war. Like there would be an angry response because people would be living in Death Valley now without water
yeah,
from the aquifers and the rivers in other states. So I think the idea of just people will go along with our large scale scheme because what else would they do? Well, the answer is shoot you and take power. So I
Yeah.
really think the leftists don't understand that, which is odd from a historical context because that's been what they've done whenever they've had a
Right.
chance.
Right. Yeah. Historically, that's where the logic ends, which is you can't implement the program without, you know, putting people in gulags at the very least, or a hole in the ground, a big hole in the ground. The gulag came after that, and yeah, but thus far, guilt tripping and moral blackmail has been enough for them.
I don't think
And
that's going to work permanently, especially with aggressive males who would have to be the group to be targeted for total feminist or
yeah,
environmentalist
yeah,
revamping of society to work. I
yeah,
mean, I think most people at some level know that beyond the Christian or Buddhist 8 things, rules aren't real. Like our policy on marijuana or whatever, the speed limit, water use is something we made up in response to conditions in our society. It has nothing to do with ethical standards from Bronze Age Israel. So, I mean, I think if people attempt to pursue this and say, well, you have a moral duty to help the starving fighting men of Somalia, a lot of people will just look through their Bible and their code of laws and say, well, no, I don't. Even to the extent that I believe these rules are real, which for me is moderate, you know, this isn't among them. I don't have to
yeah,
do that at all. I can simply keep my car and,
yeah,
vote for nuclear power and kick you guys out of the White House. And there
yeah,
seems to be a real element of confusion about this just being an obvious possibility. I mean, a lot of young men are moving to the, right of Goebbels right now, which I think
yeah,
is a bad thing for everything from race relations to Olympic athletics. But like, if you try telling these guys what we're going to do is take away your entire future because we need to let these non-functioning immigrants into your country in large numbers. I mean, once again, they're just going to see guys sitting in the front steps of their houses with guns. That's not
right,
going to occur. And it's
right,
considered almost ungentlemanly, I think might be the word, to say, well, no, man, we're just not going to let you do this because we actually have all the power in society. But there is a point where people start coming around, turning off the lights, where you're going to see that happening. I think you're seeing that in parts of the Western Cape in South Africa. You're seeing that in parts of Europe now. The USA would be a lot more blunt and violent about it. We're not known for our subtlety. Oh no, 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 yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay, sounds good.
All right, sorry guys, we've had a little technical difficulty. More bombing from B2s. We were talking about Gen Z men turning to the right, and this is definitely a true thing in the U.S. It's like the first time, basically ever, in the history of polling that I think that young men are more Republican than the general population. It's also definitely a thing in France. Like the RN, the National Rally, which is the quote unquote populist right party, is the number one party with young people. And certainly anecdotally, I mean, if you think that race discourse on Twitter is too spicy, you don't want to see French Gen Z TikTok, because it will melt your face off. Which is a huge cultural change for me, because like the French people, and we can talk about this separately, but like French people are genuinely like among the least, arguably the least racist, certainly among the least racist people on the planet, and genuinely not in the sort of fake PC way of Anglos, uh, but like Zoomer Frenchmen have zero taboos, for good or ill, just and so yeah, I mean, it's a real thing. What is it that you think that drives it? Is it just like you know, it's like it's today's form of youthful rebellion, and just like, the hippies, eventually like got a job, got a car, and voted for Reagan. The Gen Z rebels will, buy a house and vote for Gavin Newsom or whatever. What do you think?
I think there's an element of that. First of all, I mean, I do think that traditionally people have moderated as they've gotten older and gone into the actual business world, and seeing that you have to, if you're doing sales or something like that, do
Yeah,
outreach to a whole bunch of people, and they're mostly just people. I mean, I've worked on those bullpen sales floors myself. Yeah, I think it'll happen to some extent, but I think the radicalism of young men is real, and I think it's if you put aside, and it might be odd for me to say this, but if you put aside like the complex social science, like I put 18 controls in my regression model and just think about this logically, it's not at all
yeah,
surprising. I mean, if you're a young white man in the USA or much of Europe, and this isn't very much different for black or Asian men for a bunch of silly ass reasons we'll get into, but if you're a young Caucasian male in those societies, you've been told since birth that you're one of the big
yeah,
problems in that society. And
yeah,
we sometimes minimize how much this is true because there's still residual racism and hiring against minorities and all that. So, like, when you bring this point up, someone else will say, well, yeah, but it's 2% easier for the young whites to get jobs in the blue collar fields. Some of it's true. But if you look at just like Meta, for example, once did a study where they were trying to track down anti feminist rhetoric on, I guess, Facebook. And
right.
incidentally, they found, and I posted this link to my ex for those that are interested a couple of days ago. This would be July. Um, they actually found that 90% of negative rhetoric online that met their qualifications, like we should kill, which were pretty intense, was directed at men and at whites. And
Yeah,
this is very common. I mean, whatever it is, 70% of teachers are female, 78%.
yeah,
Most of those 80 something percent lean to the political left. So if you're a guy and you go all the way through grade school, middle school, then a high school or trade school, almost everyone that teaches you is going to be a left leaning woman that's promoting these ideological narratives. The American Psychological Association recently narrowly avoided voting to label normal masculinity as a mental disorder. I believe, toxic masculinity is. I could easily be wrong, but they had a discussion about the standard traits of masculinity, like aggression, willingness to fight or duel, this kind of
right.
thing, and they tried to label them as a mental illness, which would be along the lines of calling like women's kink or lesser aggression insanity. I mean,
Yeah,
it was just the craziest thing you've ever seen. And as a guy, you've no pun intended. And as a guy, you've been seeing this in the USA or in core Europe most of your life. And I think that a lot of people at the same time are noticing that a lot of things are that they're being told are not true. Like women do not seem to gravitate toward non-kinky, kindly, respectful guys who rarely hit the gym, to put it mildly. I mean, minority immigrants, Asians and Nigerians do well, but in
yeah,
general aren't overperforming whites. They're USA, if you look at IQ points, they're 8 behind generally. No, I think that most of that's cultural and closable, if not all of it, but you still notice it. You notice that your Spanish buddy is not some kind of magic genius
right,
who's enriching every element of your life. He's just a guy, and he's a guy who's doing worse in school than you are. So
right.
all of this, there's reality, and then there's this narrative that you're constantly told. And I think a lot of people are rebelling against that for kind of the same reasons that young women or young working class men rebelled against the narrative of the 1950s, where everything sounds pleasant and society often looks bucolic. I mean, everyone likes seeing the United Nations looking kids in their clean cut polos trooping into a school. But then you start analyzing it and unpacking it and realizing like they're going to send me to Korea. And it looks a lot less pleasant. And that the rebellion now, in one sense, rebellion is directed against the dominant cultural institution by
Yeah,
young people, traditionally working class men. The dominant cultural institution today is the mainstream left, and that's what we're seeing: rebellion against that.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious because of something you said, which is okay. So young men are radicalizing to the right. Of course, young women are radicalizing to the left. We know that. And if you think about it from an electoral perspective, you know, does it even out? Yes, no. You sort of look at the number with a magnifying glass, and you can debate that. But of course, if you think about it from the perspective of like actual conflict, and you pit all the young men against all the young women, that's a very short war. And so, circling back to what you were saying earlier about how, a lot of this stuff doesn't meet the test of reality. A lot of this stuff doesn't meet the test of, if you go too far, me and my friends are just going to physically stop you from doing it because it's too crazy and I'm just not going to accept it. Um, and the most potent, quote unquote, violent force in a society is the young men. Um, at the same time, another famous, and I don't even know if it's true as for a fact. It's one of the things you always hear, but you don't know if it's true. But the societies where you have major upheavals are the societies that are young, the societies that have a young average age. But America and Europe, but also America now, are aging societies. So I don't know. I don't know. If this sort of like radicalism of the young men, um and I'm not even asking like is there going to be a civil war. I'm just more asking in a broad sense, like a large cohort of young men being radicalized into some sort of right-wing opinion is like a powerful force, whether politically, culturally, or whatever. And I have no idea what the outcome is going to be. Maybe the outcome is just going to be like, uh, JD Vance JD Vance and Jordan Bardella as presidents of the U.S. and France, and then we just have normal right wing politics. Or maybe the outcome is going to be some sort of civil conflict. I don't really believe that unless things go really bad. Or maybe it's going to be something weird that we don't, we're not even anticipating. I don't know. I just think it's very interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a. I remember I recently, I guess now more than a year ago, but I did an interview with Tim Pool, who's a really funny guy in person. But I mean, like that panel of guys is very much like Civil War, like people just yell it. I don't think that's going to happen, and I mean, I think there are a lot
Yeah,
of
neither do
practical
I.
reasons for that. Even leaving aside stuff like everyone's fat, which Ozempic will probably work on.
That's a big one.
But that actually is also one of the big reasons that young women are so liberal and are not being pursued by men and are not
True.
dating. I mean, the average woman is something like 70 pounds overweight in the USA. It's
Yeah.
less of a problem in Europe. But I mean, I think if you took that away, one of the predictors of feminism, and I'm obviously not idiotically saying this is why all women were second wave feminists or something, but one of the predictors of feminism pretty strongly, and this has been said by everyone from Rush Limbaugh joking to Camille Paglia running decent models, is feeling isolated from the reproductive game. So, like society traditionally, the idea that society has been
Right.
bad for women isn't necessarily true. Women have, my friend Brooks Crenshaw, the writer and former Navy SEAL intel guy, would say that women have normally nested in the middle. Like in historical societies, as a man, if you were in the bottom 30% of males, you were just going to be killed in war. I
Right.
mean, historically, only about 45 to 50% of men have passed on DNA. But if you were in
Right.
the upper elite of men, you probably weren't raping your wife or anything like that, but you definitely had one or more wives. They weren't saying no very often as society was structured. You lived in a castle. So, I mean, the men had that extremely broad distribution. Most
Right.
women, if you look at something like what are called maids narratives, lived in reasonably happy marriages with one male partner.
Right.
So I don't think that this was inherently abusive, but it certainly wasn't equal across every legal right. Blah, blah. If you get into what predicts participation in women's movements, very often that was feeling disenchanted with the way the mating game worked. Like you didn't like not having fully equal rights. That tended to be women on the right tail of the bell curve, or you were excluded from the mating process. You were a suffragette to a point that
Right.
people found this annoying. You refused to allow wine in your house in France or the U.S. Southwest. Like there was something there that made it difficult for you to date. And I would
Right.
assume that a lot of the stuff that women are being told now, and it's not totally non-scientific. Actually, I'm a tenured professor, but this isn't something I have like a paper prompt about. But I mean, I would assume that things like being 100 pounds overweight or having followed sort of what young women are supposed to do through high school and into college, the blue hair, left wing politics, nose ring, all of that probably makes you much less dateable. and so much more
Yeah.
likely to swing to the radical left. And I would
Yeah.
tend to suspect that if you had a husband and a firstborn son, you
Yeah.
would move considerably to the right.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a bit of a sideline, but pulling those guys, Civil War might happen. USA, not only is everyone fat, which is where this came from, but also like America or France has a nuclear armed military. We've got drones. I mean, there's just not going to be like an army of young right wing Hispanic men like walking toward DC where that's
Right.
allowed to happen. We're not talking World War I conditions. A last point. You said the most radical group in society is the young men. That's obviously true. The difference with an aging society isn't that the most radical or reactionary group isn't the young men. It's just that they're more older, still somewhat competent men. And I
Right.
do think that's a regulator. And I think that that's a regulator in the positive sense, and that we're less likely to have an on the ground military conflict. It's also a regulator negatively, because one thing I do sympathize with the young guys about is this idea of it's impossible for us to move up. A lot of the
Yeah.
stuff like we can't buy a house in the slums, like shut up, that's not true. But the stuff like we can't make partner, like we can't make senior salesman, we can't do anything because these
Right.
old bastards are all here. These are from the
Right.
largest generations in history, and they're refusing
Right.
to leave because they don't think they can comfortably retire. I've seen that. I mean, if you're in a bullpen environment, your boss, he's probably a great
Right.
guy, has some wonderful stories, but he's like 62. He's not going
Right.
anywhere. He'll be there in 8, 10 years. So
Right.
what do you do? All of this is an issue. And the practical things here, like women are being told to be unattractively radical. Men are not as appealing because they can't move up in the job market. From an Evo psych perspective, this is probably driving a lot of this as versus how persuasive Gavin Newsom is or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean this is, this is another thing, which is like a big driver of quote unquote revolutions, and especially left wing revolutions, from the French Revolution to the Bolsheviks to Zoran Mamdani, is this very specific slice of people, which is downwardly mobile elites. It's
Oh,
like
yeah.
people who have some sort of elite credential, but didn't quite make it, and or didn't do as well as they think they deserve. There's a famous letter by Danton, who is one of the leaders of the French Revolution, who was like, all of us are like lawyers who went to law school on a royal scholarship, and then couldn't make money as lawyers. That was Robespierre. That was all of them were poor kids who got a scholarship from the king to
That's
attend
funny.
university, and then they got their law degree, and they can make money, and they couldn't be successful as a lawyer, and so they became activists and blah blah blah. And this is also the Mamdani demographic. This is the various socialists in Russia demographic. This is the other side of youthful radicalization that doesn't work. Um, let's
If I
talk
could
about
jump in there briefly,
yeah.
I think that's important because I think like we're gonna win, if we each have to claim one block of obnoxious young men. But like it is important to realize that there also are a lot of minority men in the United States, and there are a
Right.
lot of young women. So we're not seeing one-sided radicalism. That's New York Times talk. That's what the mainstream media tells the people. We're seeing young men swing far to the right. In fact, we've seen young men swing about 6 points to the right. What we're seeing actually is a bigger split between young men and young women, or young white and minority men. And the
True.
biggest reason for that is that young women and young people, some young people of color, have moved further to the left. So I mean, if women move 18
Yeah.
points to the left and men move 4 points to the right, you can
Right.
present that as a liberal journalist as a 22-point gap and blame men.
Right.
Not
Right.
really.
Right.
So
Right.
you're
Right.
seeing as much of
Right.
this. I mean, Mamdani is, as I understand, an Indian American, just became a citizen, communist from Uganda. He says he's a socialist, not a communist. But I mean, that's a
Yeah.
hell of a profile for a candidate. And we're going to
Yeah.
see more candidates like that. I mean, in Minneapolis, there's Omer Fateh, who is
Yeah.
Somali, second generation. I believe it's him that's joked about his family being involved in piracy back in the home country. Although that might be a joke. I'm sure it didn't happen. But I mean, like you're talking
Well,
about
if he
stuff.
did, I respect that.
Yeah, no, if his parents were pirates, that's actually pretty badass. But I recall, if you go on the message boards in Minneapolis that are talking about politics. That's actually a claim that's been made about one of the candidates. So, no slander if it's not him. But nonetheless, this is a guy who, his focus is the Somali community in that city. He, again, I believe, is a democratic socialist. He's running with DFL, a Democratic Farmer Labor Party, although it's quite mainstream in Minnesota.
Which is the Minnesota version of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, but I mean, like, you're basically, the point is, without doomsaying, you're going to see more candidates like that, just like you're going to see more candidates sort of doing, Luftwaffe talk in the next 20 years. And I mean, the ultimate example of that will be if you see J.D. Vance, who I don't think is as far to the right as he's been painted, but certainly is a favorite of the online right, running against probably not Zoran, but say AOC or something like that, where the people yelling in your computer will really seem to have popped out and started running for the presidency. I mean, and like the spokespeople for those two are going to be exactly who you think they're going to be on both sides. It's all.
This is my out of the money bet, by the way, for 2028. It's JD versus AOC. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I would put like a little bit of money on that. With good odds. Not saying it's gonna happen, just saying with good odds, I would put money on that. Yeah, I mean, the whole Mamdani thing, sidebar, but the origin of his family. So basically, when the British were running Africa and various other places, they would essentially like import Indians to be like their like mid-rank, mid-manager cast that would sort of like run the blacks for them essentially. And so you had those in South Africa, you had those in various places. And so when the British decolonized, of course, the first thing that the blacks in those countries did was try to murder all the Indians and take all their shit because they had a lot more. And so another famous progeny of that is, of course, Freddie Mercury, who's being reinvented as this like BIPOC hero, even though his family were like rah supporters of the empire, because of course the empire protected them. And when the empire, went away, they lost everything and they had to move to the UK as refugees. And so Mamdani's this, BIPOC hero of the people, even though the reason his family has education and status and money is because they were essentially like middle manager of like the British colonial empire.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you take an honest and amoral look at history, things tend to be complex. And if you're assuming incentive-based behavior, not all that surprising. So, like, just to throw out a couple things in random, the British Empire was basically good. I mean, there's some dispute in India because India is one of the great historical civilizations. So when the British arrived in India, India was actually more relatively wealthy versus the whites than it was after the British left. But even there, like overall prosperity in India, if you're looking at rail, as you know, I'm sure, but if you're looking at railroads, miles of road, income per year, education for women, all of that improved under British leadership. And there's a lot of debate about whether it would have improved under Indian leadership. The empire, the native empires in the subcontinent were fighting each other and collapsing, which is why the Brits were able to beat them, blah, blah. But anyway, for the rest of the British Empire, places like Kenya, Nigeria, I mean, I don't think there's any dispute that the overall impact was positive. Bruce Gilley wrote a book about this called The Case for Colonialism. Where he just said, I mean, like some of these had, large, formidable tribes, but the things like grade-based school that the British introduced just weren't there. I mean, even moving outside of Black Africa, I mean, some of the areas like Hong Kong, there's just no debate. I mean, that was a fishing village. And the ability of the Brits to combine sort of the best Western and the best Chinese practices and build a city is what created probably the 7th, 8th world financial capital there. So I mean, I don't have a problem with Mamdani because his family were British colonial officials or whatever the native equivalent were called. I mean, I think that's a positive in some ways.
Neither do I. I just think that
but it is funny that he's a race
that status to then portray himself as like Che Guevara.
Yeah, well, Che Guevara is actually a similar case. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi is probably the ultimate example of this.
Yeah.
I mean,
Gandhi was another example of this because he worked as a lawyer in South Africa.
Yeah, Mahatma Gandhi was a British military veteran who fought well. I think he got one serious medal and who became a lawyer. I mean, he was a member of one of the Indian quote unquote forward castes. I forget whether Brahmin or Kshatriya, but there are hundreds of
Yeah.
jati within those. But I mean, Gandhi's whole thing when he decided to seek liberation was basically a silly facade, is a little rude, but it would be the equivalent of a white revolutionary dressing up as Jesus. I
Yeah.
mean, he took his Brooks Brothers suits and hung them up in the closet, and he put on one of
Yeah.
those goatee loincloths, and he
Yeah.
started walking around speaking to these passionate crowds, mostly made up of members of the lower caste.
Yeah.
And at first, the Brits, including many of his former school friends, thought this was a joke. They weren't sure what to do with it. Like, oh, is this Mohandas out there? This street preacher outfit with the henna paint on? And I mean, it turned out to be very successful because it appealed to this broad base of Western leftists,
Yeah.
people who wanted revolution in the colonies. And I didn't know this. I thought of Mahatma Gandhi, as I suppose most Westerners do, as a secular saint until I was maybe 25. And then you start looking at this and realizing, oh, well, the British and the Indians were both civilized but brutal in their
Yeah.
way. The British
Yeah.
probably improved the place. This guy was a lawyer. He was a civil practitioner. And
Yeah.
you start to understand some things that were useful to me later when I started re-reviewing the U.S. civil rights movement and so on. But yeah, Mamdani presenting himself as an oppressed son of the soil is entertaining. I guess last line on this, I mean, his own family at its final level that produced him is not just wealthy, but extremely well known. I think both of his
Yeah.
family, mother and father, have Wikipedia pages. His
Yeah.
mother directed Mississippi Masala with Denzel Washington. I read that Mamdani had a rap career, and I assume this was a joke. Like, I mean, I've released horrible mixtapes with people and so on. But no, he actually did the song Number One Spice for a Disney movie. There are videos of him rapping about the Holy Land Five and so on. So no, I mean, a typical rich kid who was able to use the fact that he's technically a person of color, like a Lebanese or a forward caste Indian would very technically be, to
Right.
market himself to an entirely new audience.
Yeah. I mean, that's the future of democratic politics, man. It's going to be really hilarious. All right. Do you want to talk about men and women? Cause you know, I think you and we've never had a real conversation about this, but we follow each other. Have a sort of similar outlook, which I would call sort of moderate red pill, which is, A, men and women are different. B, men and women have, dark sides or sides that it's not polite to talk about to their psychology, but they are nevertheless real. But also, like be realistic, live in the real world. Don't hate women for existing or being women. Don't. I mean, don't be an incel. Some people don't choose to be an incel, but don't turn inceldom into this thing. Uh, so I mean, like all of the discourse I see was makes me want to tear out my own hair. So I don't know where to start. I mean, we were talking in the green room about this piece in the New York Times about heterofatalism, which apparently is a thing where, yeah, crazy left wing women uh, are attracted to men, but also decide that men are horrible. But also, all of the men that they're surrounded by are like low T Brooklyn hipster male feminists. So, maybe they have a point, but maybe for the wrong reason. I don't know. I don't know what to think about this.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, there's a lot of truth to the last thing you said. I mean, I think if you're familiar with the sneaky fucker strategy in biology, I mean, I
Yep.
would assume that you'd find one of the highest rates of sexual assault and so on among these twee little fellows that refer to themselves as male allies and are always there to take you
Oh,
home after a drinking party and so on. I would strongly encourage a sister or a close female friend to avoid that group altogether.
yeah.
But moving to the broader topic, I think point one would be yes, you see a lot of mainstream modern women telling themselves how wonderful they are and bemoaning heterosexuality.
Yep.
And I think a big element of that is that they've been fed this mainstream Western narrative, which now comes from the center to the fairly hard left, as we established. that's really hard on sort of human nature. So, like, wanting male dominant sex as a woman is considered really anti feminist to about half of feminists. People will say things in writing like, "You want me on all fours like a beast?" And there seems to be, and it's funny. It's just, of course, that's how the position works. You want me to touch the bump down there, but like, there's this attempt to radicalize all of this in the same way vegans will say you're comfortable tearing apart the flesh of a living creature with your teeth. One of the things that I do actually with my students, whenever I'm stuck teaching a writing class or something like that, intro stats and research methods include a big write a paper piece. One of the things I do is actually have them write out 50 completely normal sentences in hysterical, angry fashion, just to get you, like, if you ever do become a journo, this is probably what you're gonna do. And it's a fun assignment. The kids have fun with it, but that really is kind of what you're getting with the takes I just gave on eating a steak and the doggy style position. But a lot of that is pumped into just the average normal businesswoman. You should not want men to be sexually and emotionally dominant. You should want to be a fully equal financial partner in your
Right.
relationship, but you should also want to raise your own kids. Like, the mommy wars are still very real in the US upper middle
Right.
class. Just all of it. And it presents a really negative picture of male female relationships. Like, if I was a woman and I thought all sex was like what you see in hardcore pornography, and I
Right.
thought that I was going to be expected to do all of the childcare, and my friends would laugh at me, but I was also
Right.
expected to outperform my husband in the workplace, and just on and on
Right.
and on and on, I would
Right.
start hating heterosexuality. But the blue pill for the sisters listening to this, the probably a selected group of women, but is that that's all just bullshit. I mean, like, when you look at reality, like, a starting point would be that men and women are obviously different. As you said,
Yes.
that does include a dark side. So 98% of rapists, unsurprisingly, the other 2% are probably trans, but 80% of murderers, so on, are male. The flip side of that would be that women seem to be much better at long-term manipulations and intrigues, and are no
Yep.
nicer to people weaker
And
than them. Than
psychological damage.
Yeah, encouraging suicides. I mean, there are an incredible number, 50,000, I believe, across just white and black male suicides per year in the USA.
Yep.
But also, like, in terms of control over the weak, like, if you add up abortions and infanticides every year, just in my country,
Yeah.
there's 700,000. So, like, when female friends start saying, like, we could not conceive of killing, it's just like you pull up the infanticide numbers and the abortion numbers, like, what's all that? And they'll start saying, well, that's not really a person. It's, like, parasitical infestation of my body. But I think that you can say that men and women have very similar levels of darkness, but are different in
Yep.
general. So sexually,
Yep.
like, 90% of men prefer to be quote unquote dom, like you do most of the talking, you do most of the motion. 80% of women prefer to be submissive.
Yep.
This has been found over and over and over again. It's not a bad thing. I will note also for the people
I mean,
dating
it
that
depends on how you define it. Like, if you define submissive, dominant, not just like taking the initiative versus letting happen, but like a more kinky way, there's a lot more women who are submissive than men who are
oh
dominant. Because being
yeah, I
dominant is
think that
actually work.
yeah, no, it definitely is. You got to do all that talking, and I mean, it's definitely. I think that while you are distracted, having to Dungeons and Dragons game everything you're doing is a little annoying. If you're really talking about someone who's an actual BDSM sub, like, get over there, you dirty, in exactly this position. Like, we can maybe just move to not doing that. But the
Yeah.
point, though, I think, and that actually is a very interesting point, that there are far more women who are kinky and mildly dark, like sometimes have rape
Yes.
or CNC fantasies, than there are men who enjoy this kind of thing. And
Yes.
I don't care about this. I think what you do in the bedroom is no more moral or immoral than me playing Call of Duty. I mean, the simulated rating is the favorite game of humans because it's what we did for 20,000 years. And it's important to keep that in
Yeah.
mind. But if you do view this as a mild moral positive, men, I think, would come down more on the light side of this. Like, when you look at men watch
Yeah.
too much porn, but when you look at men's favorite books, it's like Kipling. You look at women's favorite books, it's like number 1 is 50 Shades of Grey, number 2 is The
Yeah.
Story of O, number 3 is 50 Shades of Grey 2. So
Yeah.
I think that the people that are buying these lecturing me about the brutality of sexuality does wear a little thin. But so, point one, women are hearing this terrible sounding narrative. You're the superwoman. You're doing all of this. 2, this is just BS. You should accept male female differences. Men do tend to be more dom. Women do tend to be more secondarily controlling, receptive, whatever other term you want to use. But I think that there's a reason why the negative narrative about masculinity and femininity is so prevalent. And in recent years, I've started using the term womanosphere because
Yeah.
there really is an
Yeah,
incredible amount.
I want to hear you talk about that because I completely agree, and yeah, I think it's really important. Go on.
Thanks, man. But I mean, I think in terms of just the practical frame that we're setting up here, there's this negative narrative of heterosexual relationships from basic submission at the level of enjoying the missionary position is bad or receptiveness or whatever else you want to call it. That also includes some crazy takes on you working as a businesswoman, childcare, all this stuff. Your life's going to be miserable if you date one of those boys. And the question is, where's this coming from? And the answer is that there's an immensely organized block of female content. I mean, an example would be the Are We Dating the Same Guy groups on Facebook, where
Yes.
there are hundreds of thousands of women involved in these networks. And they're doing things like posting pictures of random men and calling them rapists. That's not an exaggeration.
Yeah.
Or saying things like, I mean, just the simple example would be he prefers the doggy position. He must hate our faces. Like everything becomes this weird. And by the way, you can still see the face. You just see a lot of other positive things as well. It's not an insult, ladies. It's a compliment. But like in all seriousness, though, leaving banter aside, like you really do see this stuff. And I mean, if I were one of the guys in these groups, I would get a lawyer immediately. Like there's a massive. I mean, this is just insane. Like I've had friends that were posted in the. One of my friends, who's
Yeah,
a
no, that
lawyer in a major Midwestern city, was posted in one of these groups, and the claim was that he had herpes. This is from his ex-girlfriend. He does
oh
not, in fact,
shit.
have herpes. But like once this gets out there, how do you stop it? These are
Yeah.
all anonymous female profiles with names like Cleveland Catgirl from Facebook or Instagram. And this is just one of many examples. Like the #2 podcast in the country. We're not talking about like Andrew Tate's Hustlers University or something.
Right.
This is Joe Rogan level. Is Call Her Daddy, which is just
Right.
conscious discussion of like every sexual topic in a way
Yeah.
that somehow criticizes both men and women. A typical episode name would be like Sweet White Rain, Why I Like Facials or something like that. And there's
Oh
also
my
just a
god.
massive amount of criticism of males in there. And it just goes on and on. I mean, like I said, 90% of the content between the sexes that was negative was directed at men. So you have these Reddit forums, should I divorce
Yeah.
him? And a consistent theme of this stuff is that
And the
doing.
answer is always yes.
Yeah, the answer is about 89% of the time, yes. Yeah. And the things that people did, like one of the most famous cases that actually broke out of this weird world and went viral on Twitter, where normal men were saying, this is absolutely insane, was a guy who was a phone lineman, which is one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. So he's climbing these poles in storms and he's
Right.
clipping these electric live wires. And when he goes home, he only does about 20% of the chores. He also makes all the money, as I recall. And
Right.
this woman said, I feel like he doesn't contribute. Should I go? And all of these women were saying, yes, queen, you beautiful lady. Don't do it. You deserve better. And I think it probably saved a marriage that all these men and housewives that on Twitter and Facebook started chipping in and saying,
Yeah.
you
And by the way, like men who do these kinds of jobs make like good six figures, like at least
yeah,
150K and more with seniority and like extra hours and hazard pay and so on, because like not many people want to do these jobs and they're skilled. So guys who are like, oil rig workers and all that, like these guys are making good money. But
yeah,
they're working really hard. They're working with their body, and as you say, they're like taking physical risk with their safety. So like yeah,
yeah. If
that's
you're
the kind
doing
of
oil,
partner who actually like deserves a, a sandwich when he comes home from work, and maybe even a blowjob in the morning.
yeah, absolutely. Because you're going, but I mean, I think that actual point, like, this is one of the points I made online, that if you made the extremely obvious point, you should sometimes give your romantic partner head and make them food, which I
Right,
think in either a US city or in France would have been utterly non-controversial for
right,
all of time. I mean, maybe
right,
since 1910s when people stopped taking the sodomy laws all that seriously.
right,
But I mean, for 100 years, this is just a piece of relationship advice. If you say
right,
that online now, especially as a man, you're
right.
guaranteed to be mobbed by these crazy people who say things like, and it's important to break down all of these, like, I can divorce at any time for any reason. I have
Right.
no responsibility to sexually satisfy my man, is something you see over and over again. You sometimes see emotionally satisfy.
Yeah,
I have no duty to play a domestic role, even if he makes most of the money. And like a lot of these claims are objectively wrong. Like, no one can ever make you do anything. You shouldn't rape your partner. You should just leave. But I mean, the idea that you don't have some responsibility to
Yeah,
financially, emotionally, physically, etc., make the person you're married to happy is crazy. Like, that's
yeah,
actually a violation of Christian and civil marital law. Like,
yeah,
lack of normal marital relations, which includes sex and includes men working, is a grounds for fault divorce in every state in the union.
yeah,
But you
and
have this
in
this
every law.
oh, so in France as well, yeah, just in every country, I would imagine, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. There was a famous, so the term in the Napoleonic Code is that one of the obligation of marriage is common life.
Yeah.
And some woman tried to get a divorce because her husband moved away for work, and the Supreme Court had clarified that no, common life doesn't mean living in the same place. It's just a euphemism for sex. Uh,
Good
and so
job,
they were
court.
like, well, I mean, did he come home on the weekends? Yes. Did you have sex when he came home? Yes. Okay. Well, no. So you have no grounds for divorce.
This is a very French decision. I mean, I picture some judge sitting there like, no, that is not. I mean, it refers to the bedroom, you fool. We are simply polite in Europe. But no, I mean, at any rate, like, I think there is an element of obvious reality to that, though. I mean, the U.S.
Yeah.
term's a bit
And
clunkier, but like,
there. Sorry, just finishing this. There's the other obvious element of reality is that, there was always this idea that one of the rules of marriage is obligation to have sex and to sexually satisfy each other. But like, it's not like our great grandparents, were like our great grandfather was like brutally raping his wife whenever he felt like
that's
it.
correct.
Like
Yeah.
in real life, you live with another person, and so you're constantly like making compromises, because even if,
Yes.
quote unquote legally the male has all the power, whatever, you're living with this person and you have to raise kids with them. And so even though technically or theoretically you could do all sorts of heinous shit to them, you're actually not going to. um and so, but
Yeah. It's also worth
the idea
noting.
that it was considered normal just made things easier. It was a lubricant, no pun intended, um for having a more active and regular sex life. Anyway,
Yeah, no, I
just
think
wanted to
that's
make that
correct.
second point.
Yeah, that's correct. And we actually, like I said earlier, we have the diaries of sort of young working and
Right.
farm wives from this period, and we know how often sexual and domestic violence occurred. And it was significantly rarer than it is today. Like, not
Right.
excusing the bad husbands of that era, but an important point is, like, the least likely person to go crazy on you is a husband or wife.
Right.
So, what we've seen, because women, and this actually probably accounts for a lot of the disenchantment with heterosexuality, right? The lack
Yeah.
of committed relationships with men, partly because modern women are making them impossible, combined with modern dating and erotica culture. And so it's like you are being asked to do, all kinds of wild shit with people that you
Right.
just met at a
Right.
nightclub. And that's actually much more dangerous than having to give your husband a blowjob twice a week, having in
Right.
quote marks. So, like, the rate of sexual violence, a lot of this is due to weird redefinition, I will be
Right.
honest and say. But the rate of sexual violence in the USA or core Europe has increased dramatically since 1950. I could pull up Disaster Center or FBI and check this right now, actually, but it's something like 40,000 reported rapes a year. And this is after the point where people would have started reporting, up
Right.
to 231,000 or something, because
My
you're much
God.
less likely to be abused by your partner than by strange people or in
Right.
situations like
Some guy
fraternity
you
parties.
invited home
Yeah.
for quote unquote a drink.
Yeah. And I
Um,
mean, again, there's women, rape is never okay, but women are not free of all logical culpability there. I mean, when people say that rape cases are very difficult to prosecute, that's because the typical rape case isn't,
yeah.
a recent immigrant with a knife jumping out from behind a bush and grabbing you, although that does
Yeah.
happen
Yeah.
disturbingly often. It's a situation where you go to a rave or a fraternity event.
Yeah.
You're comfortable having oral sex with two guys, but not vaginal sex with a third guy. And you try to bring that to a totally unsympathetic police detective who's got murders to solve. And the report sits for a while. You know, Not justifying that, but there are very
Yeah.
easy, like, as a guy, I'll put it this way: there are very easy ways not to get into a violent brawl. I'm sure, both been in one.
Yeah.
These happen at bars, these happen at
Yeah.
athletic events. But, like, you can just do things like not get drunk and wear the rival team jersey to your section and talk trash, and it cuts your odds of fighting down about
Yes.
95%. And there are similar rules like don't get drunk with opposite sex strangers. This is true for
Right.
men as well in the era of false
Right.
allegations that I
Right.
would give to a daughter or a son that would presumably keep them out of 90% of these situations. You can't avoid the other 10%. There's risk in
Right.
life.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that telling people that they don't have any emotional, sexual, or financial duties in relationships and that they should get divorced whenever there's an argument is a negative and foolish thing to tell them. And it's going to lead to extreme conflict. So the Womanosphere, when I'm using that term, I'm referring to everything from CHD, the pod, over to the massive Reddit pages on divorce, over to the Facebook groups full of women, to Twitter's whole sphere of feminist women that will jump in every time you say something like, why wouldn't she hook up and give me a sandwich after work? All of that is promoting a certain view of heterosex relationships that's almost entirely negative. And a last thing, but like when you talk about marriage and you say, and again, we have the records of this, when you say like traditional marriages weren't wildly sexually abusive, there's a whole network of things that played into that. Like the average woman had 4 brothers for much of history. 4 siblings, 2 brothers. But you're not just going to do that. They would leave and go live with their mother for a year and you'd have to physically deal with their relatives. Women in Europe and most of the USA were in charge of the poisons and guns in the household. Like you're not just going to abuse your. By the way, also the rule that violence within a family was not
That's a very
considered a
good point. They're
crime.
not going to abuse the person who makes the food.
Yeah, and who controls all the rat poison? I mean, like but the rule though that probably wouldn't have been prosecutable either. The rule was, as I understand, I don't know much about French law, but actually an expert in American law. The rule was that violence within a family, you get in a fist fight with your brother about the family business, that was not prosecuted in the same fashion as external stranger violence. And you can argue that at the extremes that could lead to sexual violence against a wife. It could also lead to her saying no by swatting her husband with a frying pan, by the way. No one would prosecute that either.
Yes.
But the reason for that rule is that you don't want family members to have small internal disputes around he forgot the safe word kind of points and go to the police and get devastating home-ending divorces. And that actually is where we are now because there was such insistence on changing that rule. Now you do have entire internet groups that will tell you how to get a divorce. And the divorce rate is down, but it's 43%, something like that. It's a terrible figure.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
I mean, this is one of the things that I can't stop obsessing about. We're running out of time. I know. You know what? I think we've got enough material, and I need to release you. We have the traditional question, which we do at the end of every podcast.
Okay.
Recommend a book. Can be any book, fiction, nonfiction, recent, old, but it cannot be in your area of expertise.
Okay, the book I usually recommend when people ask that is Thomas Sowell's Vision of the Anointed, which everyone should read. But I would actually recommend the collected poems of Rudyard Kipling this time, which I actually just read. His ancestors probably fought some of mine, given where they were distributed globally. But it's one of the great
his ancestors
books.
Probably fought some of mine.
Yeah, that's a good point. His ancestors fought everybody and conquered half the world. Limey bastards.
So did mine.
Yeah, no, I mean it's there's actually an interesting story there. Like I'm Celtic, Irish, Bantu, apparently from the lower nobility in that region. Although I'm sure they tell everyone that on the DNA test, and a bit Plains Indian. And so all of my ancestors were pretty notable warriors, but they all lost to specific British descended people within about 150 years. So it's dark. But anyway,
that makes you an honorary Frenchman.
Oh, that's a good point. Thank you. I'm touched by that actually. But Kipling, though, one of the great, even though his people roguishly fought both of ours, one of the great guy poets. The Widow at Windsor, all that. I'd recommend that people actually read some of those. They're all very chantable if you go out drinking, but it's a totally different view of poetry than like Maya Angelou's a word, a bird on the page, a verb style, which has become the norm in rap and slam and so on. So anyway, go check out some traditional poetry. That'd be my starting point.
That's a really good recommendation. I love this question. I always get such great recommendations. Anyway, Wilfred Reilly, thank you so much for your time. This was a lot of fun, just bantering for an hour. I could have gone too easily, but we both have jobs. But this was a lot of fun, and I really appreciated it. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
I did. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Have a good day, sir.
Go ahead.